Thank you, Ruth. Now, if you're worried that we haven't had a reading yet, and I've already leapt up, do not fear. I'm going to introduce the book of Ruth first to put it in context, and then Carl is going to come and read part of the book. Although it is a short book, it's a bit much to read the whole thing, really, in a morning service, but there is just so much in it. And when we get to the reading, you probably notice that it's not going to be on the screen, but you do have Bibles on your tables. And it's because it's quite a long reading, it would be great, really, if you could follow it. But first of all, let's put it into context. We are now resuming our series on characters from the Old Testament, and particularly the connection between Jesus and these characters and their stories in the Old Testament. And the one that I've got really is a classic, I do have to say. There's just so much, so many parallels. So before we hear some of the reading from Ruth 3 and 4, let me remind you of what's happened in the first two chapters. We don't actually know who wrote this book. We think that it was probably written around the time of David. And it has to be at least then or afterwards, because David is mentioned in the genealogy. We do know, because it says in the beginning of the book, that the action takes place in the time of the judges, which was roughly about 1050 before Christ. It was a time of political and moral chaos. It was a time when there was no king, and before the kings, and the country of Israel was in national decline. Ring any bells? In chapter 1, the story begins with a family in Bethlehem, in Judah, Naomi and Elimelech and their two sons. But, of course, because there was a famine at that time in Bethlehem, they decide to travel to the nearby country of Moab. Now, I suspect these Bibles, I didn't check, have a map in the back. But anyway, in order to get from Bethlehem to Moab, it's quite a long journey, actually, in the days before speedy transport. Probably at least 100 miles, depending on where exactly in Moab they were. And we read that they lived there for 10 years. It seems that Elimelech, the head of the family, probably dies soon after their arrival, leaving Naomi with two sons. And during those years, again, we don't know exactly at what point in the 10 years, they both marry Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. Alas, tragedy strikes again, and both the sons die. Now, we don't hear of any children, which is also interesting. So we don't know. They may not been married for very long. But what that situation that leaves Naomi and her daughters-in-law is in a very vulnerable situation. So hearing that famine is over in Judah, it's interesting, the little sort of nuggets of detail. She hears of it in the fields. I love that. The gossip in the fields. Oh, have you heard? Have you heard? The famine's over. And so she decides to go back home. And you remember she tries to persuade Orpah and Ruth to stay. And after all, that's their home. They are Moabites, and to return to their families. But of course, Ruth will not accept that. She is determined to go. And there's that lovely verse in chapter 1:16. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. And very significantly, your God will be my God. So they make the long journey back to Bethlehem. Now, again, that's not going to be an easy journey for two women. We don't know whether they went with a group, but it would be quite a challenge to travel that distance. It's important for us to understand the context of this sort of society. It was very much a patriarchal society where women were not the people who were in charge or made the decisions. And Naomi and Ruth needed to live under the protection of a male relative. So in chapter 2, we see that Naomi tells Ruth to go and glean, that means get the bits of the harvest that are left, to find food. And this was a custom of the time. Amazingly, it turns out that Ruth gleans in the field of Boaz, who was a close relative of her husband. We know he shows her great kindness and generosity throughout the whole of the harvest season. And now, cue for Carl, we pick up the story at the beginning of chapter 3. So it's going to be an excerpt from chapter 3 and from chapter 4.
So the first reading is from chapter 3, and it covers verses 1 to 13. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a young woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am your guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." The second reading is from chapter 4 in Ruth, and it covers verse 1 to 17. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there, just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth, the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David.
Thank you, Carl. That was a bit of a mammoth reading, but it's such an amazing story. And it is actually lovely to see so many open Bibles, I have to say. But then I'm a bit biased on that, aren't I? There are so many themes in this book and many pointers to Jesus himself. Kindness, for example, is one of the central themes, which we see both in Ruth and in Boaz, as well as God's loving kindness in the way he cares for these women. Such a key theme, not just in this book, but in the Psalms and throughout the whole Bible. There's also the theme of loyalty, which is shown particularly by Ruth in her support of Naomi. Many people have seen this as a great love story. Ruth's love for Naomi, Boaz for Ruth, and ultimately God's love for us. Then there's also the theme of mercy and care for the foreigner, which of course was written in Jewish law. And then in New Testament times, Jesus extending that mercy to all and not just to the Jewish nation. There's also the theme of from emptiness to fullness, a new life, which you see in the story of Naomi as she returns to Bethlehem empty. And yet through the Lord's blessing and Boaz's generosity, her needs are provided for. And at the end of the story, she herself is able to bless God that her life has returned to fullness as she sits there cradling the baby. Hope for the future through the birth of Obed, who of course is an ancestor of David and ultimately of Jesus. Now, you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to take all of those themes because you could do a sermon on any one of them today. But I just want to focus on one that is probably the biggest one of the lot, which I'm sure you will have noticed. Boaz is seen as Ruth's guardian or kinsman redeemer. We need to go back to those chapters we've just read there to see how and why this happens. One of the commentaries that I read, someone called Stephanie Van Eyck writes this: "The role of kinsman redeemer is found in Leviticus 25. If an Israelite man died and did not leave behind a son, then the brother of the deceased man is commanded to take his widow as a wife, and both redeem the land and provide a son to carry on the father's name. Now, this is what Ruth alleges, as told by Naomi, is the position of Boaz in Ruth chapter 2. And it's her responsibility to plead, as it were, with Boaz to fulfill this responsibility. Now, the narrative of this story probably seems a bit strange to us, to be honest. All this business of sandals and turning over bedclothes and the like. But it was very much part of the custom of the day, as Ruth goes to the threshing floor and lies at the feet of Boaz when he's asleep. Now, that in itself might seem a little presumptuous. And then she has been told that she is to uncover his feet, so that when she wakes up, she will be able to challenge him to be her redeemer. But again, we have to understand that actually this would have had a lot of meaning at that time. And her advice, Naomi's advice, is clearly for the purpose of appealing to Boaz in his obligation. And when she says, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer, this would actually be seen as a request for marriage. Again, a little bit unusual that the woman is doing this. There's a lot that is turned upside down in this story. And apparently, it is still a custom in some Middle Eastern countries today as part of the sort of betrothal. Being the godly man that he is, Boaz actually, you could imagine, he would have been quite annoyed, really. I mean, he's already impressed by Ruth and her kindness. But he receives her offer, but he does have to explain to her there's a slight glitch here because there is someone who is a closer relative than he is. And so to do this properly, he has to give him the option. So again, we have another thing that may seem a little strange to us. The next morning, off they go to the town gate in the presence of the elders with the man who should rightly be Ruth's redeemer. And there we begin to see the cost of the redemption, what it would mean to take on this responsibility. It's not just a case of saying, okay, I'll marry her and she can have children with me. There's a financial implication, a big one, actually. He has to buy Naomi's land, the family land, as well as marry Ruth and take care of Naomi. That's got big financial implications. Now, that much, he says, the first part, the rightful redeemer says, well, I'm okay. Yeah, I can buy the land. That's fine. But he draws the line at, as it says, acquiring Ruth. Now, that phrase seems very strange to us. Apparently, it doesn't mean what we would think of. It's not as if she were his property, but rather that he would agree to take care of Ruth and Naomi, as it were, to take them under his wing. There's another parallel there, I think, from some of the Psalms about us being taken under his wing. The first guy says, no, I can't do it. It's too costly. And the reason, it's fair enough, really. It would have affected his own family's inheritance. And therefore, he withdraws his offer and passes it to Boaz, which we understand is what really was meant to be, what God had in mind. He is willing to pay the price. The sandal ritual apparently seals the deal, and of course was a custom of the day. Boaz is quite a hero of this situation. He shows great loving kindness and generosity. He provides for Ruth. He offers her safe refuge. From being a widow and a foreigner, Ruth is adopted into the chosen people. More and more parallels all the way along. Van Eyck comments, though Ruth arrived at Boaz's bed empty-handed and humble to the core, Boaz treated her with respect and kindness. Disgraced by her position and despised for her ethnicity, the young Moabite woman appears to have little to offer. Yet, despite all this, Boaz views her as a kind and worthy woman. As a redeemer, Boaz not only takes Ruth as his wife, but he also fulfills the law by producing a son to carry on the family line. And we know that in time that led to King David, Ruth's great-grandson, and eventually to King Jesus himself. Only last Sunday, we were reminded of the true cost of our redemption. Surely this story is an amazing picture of the gospel. Certainly we can see in many ways that Boaz foreshadows what Jesus would do. Jesus, the ultimate kinsman redeemer, who too paid the price, the ultimate price, when he died on the cross for our redemption. I just want to throw in here a little personal testimony. A couple of weeks ago, we were doing Easter presentations, facts presentations to every year 6 pupil in Fleet. And whenever we do it, one person is asked, could you tell us in 2 minutes what Easter means to you? Well, I did that one day. And this is what I said, because it's very closely connected to this. I said, when I was a child, I knew the story of Easter. I was brought up in the church. I mean, after all, my father was a minister, so I had to be. I knew the stories. I could tell you them, but I didn't know Jesus as my Savior. When I was 9 years old, which I hate to say is nearly 60 years ago, one Good Friday, I was at church as usual, and again I heard the story of Good Friday. And probably for the first time, it really struck me. Why should somebody allow themselves to be nailed to a cross? I mean, that must have been excruciating. They didn't need to be there. They hadn't done anything wrong. I just couldn't get over that. Why should Jesus allow himself to die? And of course, the reason was because he loved us, because he loved me. He loved each one of us. And that was the moment nearly 60 years ago when I gave my life to Jesus. Been a lot happened since then, but he's never let me down. And I am still overpowered by his love, the love of my Redeemer. It was costly for Jesus, but he did it because of his loving kindness, so that we too could be adopted into his family, just as Ruth was adopted into the family, and that we can know the fullness of life that he alone can offer. The challenge to us is surely to accept that love. Maybe some of you here have never done that before, but to be reminded of what it cost him and recommit our life to him and share it with those we love. Amen.